Disagreed to, and I call the member for Macnamara.
Thank you very much, Deputy Speaker. President Biden, before the last election, famously said tackling climate change equals jobs. Good union jobs. And he was right then, and he is right today. The more we do, the more jobs we are going to create in this country. And unfortunately, this government will be remembered for those who did as little as possible in their time in this place, those who did as little as possible to tackle climate change, and those who did as little as possible, resulting in as few jobs created for Australians and as few benefits created for Australian consumers. This bill should have been here years ago. This government should have had the vision to bring forward this bill for some time already. This bill has been called for by the Labor Party for quite some time now, and of course we support it, but we take this opportunity to say that the dithering and the inaction by this government is costing Australians jobs, it's costing us time in the battle against climate change, and ultimately will be what this government is remembered for. At a recent hearing for the Environment and Energy Committee, we had the Australian energy market operator come and present to the committee. One of the more interesting pieces of evidence that AEMO brought to the committee was that in AEMO's projections, if we do nothing, we are going to head towards over 90% on average renewables in the grid by the 2040s in Australia. Now, that's not bad. That means at any given time, 100% of the grid will be powered by renewables by 2040. It'll mean that there'll be some time where there'll be firming required on average, which is what AEMO's projections are. But AEMO was very clear that the majority of the time there will be 100% renewable in the grid, and on average we'll have at least 90% renewable energy. But the interesting bit about AEMO's evidence, Deputy Speaker, was that that was based on no changes to current policy. If we literally just sit back and watch the market evolve as we are watching it right now, that's the outcome that we can expect. That's where we can get to. But that's not what we should be aiming for. We shouldn't be aiming for just sitting back and watching the market evolve without ambition and without targets and without a sense of where we want to get to. We could be exporting renewable energy, but if we sit back and just watch, then it's only just going to be enough to get us to 90% on average in the early 2040s, and we can and we should do much, much better than that. Tasmania is already the first state to be exporting renewable energy to the mainland. We should be exporting renewable energy to Asia and to Southeast Asia in particular. The Sun Cable project will potentially provide Singapore with a third of its energy, and we are already talking about other major projects, and some of which I'm going to touch on, which are going to be generating huge amounts of energy, not just for Australia, but potentially to send off overseas. And why is this important? Is because renewable energy is cheap. It's the cheapest form of energy. If you want to know why power prices have any shot of coming down, and have come down in recent times, it's because of the influx of solar and wind into our grid. Gas has not become cheaper. Coal has not become cheaper. Nuclear is as expensive as it ever, and we obviously haven't got that in Australia. The reason why consumers are benefiting is because of the influx of renewable energy. Of course, we need to introduce renewable energy to help tackle climate change. But we also need to do it to help save Australians, save Australian families with their energy bills, save Australian businesses money when it comes to the cost of energy. Wind is that much cheaper as compared to fossil fuels and other forms of energy that it is just insane that those on that side of the House are still peddling the nuclear energy option. Instead of focusing on renewables, setting targets for renewables, seeking how much renewables we can bring into the grid, we still have the Nationals, even this week, talking about the fantasy of nuclear energy. I'll tell you what will happen if we bring in nuclear energy into this country, is that household bills would skyrocket. They would skyrocket. AEMO themselves have said that it would be cheaper, if you look at their GenCost report, it would be cheaper to build 2 coal-fired power stations and just not use one of them than it would be to build a nuclear power plant. That's how crazy expensive nuclear energy is. And I know that those opposite, the next obvious retort is well, what about SMRs? Sure, we should keep an eye on SMRs, but they don't exist yet. So until they do, we don't really have a point of comparison, and we certainly don't have a sense of what they're going to cost Australian consumers. What we do know now is that wind and solar is cheaper. They are cheaper, much, much cheaper. And the brilliant thing about offshore wind is that the turbines are bigger. They are larger than the onshore turbines. If you look at the scale of what can be built offshore versus the size of the turbines that can be built onshore, you can build much, much bigger turbines offshore. And obviously, the larger the turbine, the more energy it can create. And also, some of these turbines can turn very quickly. These are huge energy-generating machines. They are the proposal for the Star of the South offshore wind farm in Gippsland is to have turbines of over 300 metres tall. 300 metres tall. This is not small machinery. These are big, big pieces of machinery. These are labour-intensive pieces of machinery. Not only do we need to build these things, but we also need to assemble them and we need to maintain them. These are big, big industry and big job potentials, and they create a lot of energy, and they create a lot of very, very cheap and comparatively cheap energy. But of course, one of the key recommendations of the Senate inquiry and one of the key differences between the government and the Labor Party is that you can't just build these big wind turbines offshore and then flick on the switch and then expect them to actually connect into the grid. You need to build the transmission lines from these new energy-generating offshore wind farms to the grid, to the electricity grid. Now, the Star of the South in Gippsland is a huge wind farm. It potentially could create enough energy to do about a fifth of all of Victoria's energy needs. We know, unlike those opposite who are still wrapping their minds around whether or not the wind blows at night time, we know that offshore wind is more consistent and less intermittent than onshore wind. We also know that they require less firming, and we know that it is still possible to generate wind energy at night time, and we also know that dispatchable energy and storing energy is something that we need to do and we need to be thinking about. But these are huge energy-generating projects, but they must be connected into the grid, and that is why the Labor Party, one of the first announcements by the Leader of the Opposition, the member for Greenlow, made in his first budget in reply was the $20 billion Rewiring the Nation policy. Because what this policy does is that it connects all of the new renewable energy generation projects to the existing grid. It's being able to not only connect these huge offshore wind farms, but also a lot of the smaller generation energy generators that we're seeing. Solar rooftop has been extremely disruptive to the energy grid because of the way in which it creates energy on a much smaller scale. We need to be thinking about both these new and modern ways of creating and generating energy, and as well as these huge potential for new large-scale energy generation in offshore wind, and figuring out ways in which we can connect them to the grid and a way in which we can provide certainty for investors. We don't need to fund it. We don't need to do what the government's doing and completely steamroll the private sector and invest over $600 million into a gas peaking plant that Kerry Schott, the chair of the Energy Security Board, herself said may only be used for a couple of days a year. It may only be used for a couple of days a year. We don't need to waste and throw good money after bad into a gas peaking plant that we clearly do not need. We need to provide the framework, the policy settings, the certainty, the legislation in this place to be able to give a clear signal to businesses and to the private sector that this is the vision that we want to have. This is the amount of renewable energy we're going to be using. This is the certainty that you can bank on in order to invest in the Australian market and invest in the future of our energy generation. We can do so much more than we are at the moment. We can do so much. I thought I was being spoken to, but clearly not. We can do. No one's speaking to me. We can do so much more than we currently are, with vision, with certainty, and with signals to the private sector about the sort of Australia that we want to get to. We cannot do, as AEMO is predicting and working on the basis of at the moment, which clearly sums up the Morrison government, that if we sit back and do nothing, here's where we might get to. No. We need to come into this place, set clear ambitions, clear policy, clear frameworks, clear legislation, so that we can achieve things and get the best result for Australian consumers, as well as be a part of the global efforts to tackle climate change. Offshore wind in Australia has the potential to generate over 2,000 gigawatts. 2,000 gigawatts. At the moment in Australia, we only require about 55 gigawatts. This technology has the potential to not only power Australia, but also turn Australia into a renewable energy exporter, a renewable energy battery, a renewable energy superpower. This is exciting. It's exciting for our country. And yet those opposite have been wrangling themselves in a knot, They have been at war with one another, and then they have, after weeks of burying themselves in the cave, they have extracted themselves from the cave, only to be brandishing a glossy brochure that says it all into the one heading that this brochure is based on existing policies. Nothing changed this week under the Morrison government. All the Morrison government did was rebadge existing policies, and Australia is missing out. Australia is missing out on the job creation opportunities of renewable energy. Australian consumers are missing out on cheaper electricity. Australian businesses are missing out on cheaper electricity to help power Australian manufacturing and bring down the cost of businesses. Australian businesses are missing out on the opportunity of investing in renewable energy to help not only power our country, but also our region. We can do so much more and so much better than this government. We can do so much better than the National saying and finding excuses about whether or not they support renewable energy at night time. We can do so much better than the Liberal Party and the National Party at war with one another to only agree on whatever they started with in the first place. We can do so much better than weeks of charades and media conferences and announcements and marketing and spin, only to land in the very place where we began. We can do so much better than the rabble that this government is, who at each and every stage have tried to dismantle the very institutions that have powered our renewable energy future. We can do so much better than trying to take the clean energy out of the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. We can do so much better than this government, who at each and every turn has sought to slow down the renewable energy development for this country. We can do better under an Albanese Labor government, and that is exactly what this country needs.
I thank the member for Macnamara. The original question was that this bill be now read a second time. To this, the honourable member for McMahon